James Harrison had always considered himself a reasonable man. When he and his wife, Emily, moved into Pinecrest Gardens, they believed they were settling into a peaceful, upscale neighborhood where they could build a future. Their home was their sanctuary, a two-story colonial with a well-maintained lawn, a charming front porch, and a garden Emily tended with pride. But their illusion of suburban bliss was shattered one crisp autumn morning when James found a neatly folded envelope tucked into the door handle. Inside, an official-looking letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA, informed him that his rose bushes were 2 inches too tall, violating the community's strict landscaping guidelines. At first, James dismissed it as an overzealous enforcement of neighborhood rules, something easily corrected with a quick trim. But then came another notice, a fine of $50 for a mailbox that supposedly did not meet HOA standards, despite being the same design the previous owner had used for years. Within days, more letters followed. His holiday wreath was deemed excessively large, his driveway had minor cracks, and a decorative water feature in the backyard was labeled aesthetic pollution. Each infraction came with a fine, and each fine felt more absurd than the last. James soon realized that the barrage of violations wasn't random, it was targeted. The notices came with increasing frequency, and every appeal he made was swiftly denied with curt, pre-written responses. His neighbor, Douglas Miller, a retired school principal who had lived in Pinecrest Gardens for over 15 years, took him aside one evening as they both retrieved their mail. "You need to be careful, James," Douglas warned in a hushed tone. "Karen Thompson, the HOA enforcer, has a history of driving people out. She did it to the Kaplans last year, hit them with thousands in fines until they couldn't take it anymore. They sold their house at a loss, and guess who bought it? Her brother." James felt a chill run through him. He had heard Karen's name before. Her picture was prominently displayed on every HOA bulletin, and her presence loomed over every community event. With her sharp suits and ironclad grip on neighborhood rules, she had positioned herself as the ultimate authority, and now it seemed she had a personal vendetta against him. Determined to fight back, James started looking into Karen's enforcement history. What he found was alarming. Over the past 5 years, more than a dozen families had sold their homes under eerily similar circumstances, after months of mounting fines, relentless inspections, and HOA-backed legal threats. In nearly every case, the homes were eventually purchased by a development company owned by none other than Karen's brother, Richard Thompson. James's stomach churned with the realization, this wasn't about community standards, it was a calculated scheme. Karen wielded her position to create an unbearable living situation for targeted homeowners, forcing them to sell their properties below market value. Once Richard acquired the homes, they were either flipped for profit or leased to high-paying tenants who had no knowledge of the HOA's corrupt practices. The entire operation was a well-oiled machine, and James was the latest victim caught in its gears. Within 2 weeks, James found himself drowning in fines totaling $1,400. His attempts to contest them were met with stonewalling and bureaucratic indifference. Meetings with the HOA board ended in frustration, with Karen smugly citing obscure bylaws and dismissing his concerns with thinly veiled disdain. When James refused to pay the fines, Karen escalated the matter by placing a lien on his property, effectively holding his home hostage. "You should consider selling, Mr. Harrison," she suggested with an infuriating smirk when he confronted her outside her office. "It would save you a lot of trouble." That was the moment James decided he wouldn't be bullied. Instead of giving in, he doubled down, gathering every piece of evidence he could find. He documented the harassment, recorded interactions with HOA board members, and reached out to other homeowners who had suffered similar fates. He knew he was up against a powerful adversary, but he refused to let Karen and her cronies dictate his future. James's investigation led him to an even more shocking discovery. The corruption within the HOA extended beyond targeted harassment. Hidden in the association's financial records, which he obtained through a sympathetic former board member, were unexplained transactions, fraudulent maintenance fees, and dubious expense reports that pointed to embezzlement. The HOA wasn't just extorting homeowners, it was a front for a money-laundering operation benefiting Karen, Richard, and a select group of board members. Furious and armed with undeniable proof, James took the next step. He filed an official complaint with the State Housing Board, alleging selective enforcement, fraud, and unethical business practices. But Karen wasn't going to let him win that easily. In a desperate bid to silence him, she called an emergency HOA meeting, where she proposed an outrageous motion. James's home, she claimed, was an eyesore and a detriment to the community. The board should seize it under the pretense of building a neighborhood park. But James knew the truth. This wasn't about beautification. It was about eliminating him as a threat and handing his property over to Richard for redevelopment. The battle had escalated, and now there was no turning back. As James sat through the emergency HOA meeting, he watched Karen spin her web of lies with practiced ease. She stood at the front of the room, gesturing dramatically toward a slideshow presentation that painted his home as a so-called community nuisance. The photographs displayed were deliberately unflattering, his front lawn captured at an angle that made it look overgrown, his mailbox with a shadow falling across it to make it appear broken, and his backyard fountain with water levels slightly off. "We cannot allow one homeowner to devalue an entire neighborhood," Karen proclaimed, her voice dripping with self-righteousness. "We propose that Mr. Harrison's property be repurposed into a beautiful community park, a place where our children can play safely." James clenched his fists beneath the table. He had anticipated this move, but seeing it play out in real time was infuriating. He took a deep breath and stood up. "I'd like to address the board," he announced, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the attendees. Karen shot him a withering glare, but she had no choice but to let him speak. With deliberate calm, he walked to the front of the room, plugged a USB drive into the projector, and brought up his own set of images and documents. "I think the community deserves to see what's really happening here," he said, turning to face the crowd. The first slide showed a list of homeowners who had sold their properties under pressure from the HOA. The second slide showed public property records. Each home had been purchased by a shell company linked to Richard Thompson. A murmur of unease spread through the room. James clicked again, and this time, a financial breakdown appeared. "The HOA's funds are being mismanaged," he continued. "Here are invoices for community improvements that never happened. Here's a $20,000 expense listed as emergency repairs, but no such work was ever done. And here's the most damning piece of evidence: direct payments from the HOA's discretionary account to a company owned by Karen's brother." The room fell into stunned silence. Even Karen's staunchest supporters exchanged uncertain glances. Karen, however, remained defiant. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed. "These are nothing but baseless accusations from a homeowner who refuses to follow the rules." But James wasn't finished. He played an audio recording from a conversation he had secretly recorded between Karen and another board member. In it, Karen explicitly discussed forcing homeowners out and coordinating with Richard to acquire their properties cheaply. The reaction was immediate: gasps, whispered conversations, and then outright shouting as residents demanded answers. Karen's smug expression finally cracked. That night, James knew he had won a battle, but the war was far from over. The next move, he suspected, would be desperate. And he was right. At 2:37 a.m., James and Emily were jolted awake by the piercing sound of their smoke alarm. The smell of burning wood filled their nostrils as they stumbled out of bed. The hallway was thick with smoke, and when James threw open the bedroom door, he saw flames licking the staircase. "Emily, go! Get out!" he shouted, shoving her toward the window. Their only escape was the backyard, and without hesitation, they climbed down from the second-floor balcony, barely making it before the roof caved in. The fire department arrived minutes later, but by then, the house was a total loss. As James stood in the cold night air, watching everything he had built collapse into smoldering ruins, a firefighter approached him. "We found evidence of tampering in your electrical panel," the man said grimly. "This wasn't an accident." James's stomach turned. He didn't need to hear any more. He knew exactly who was responsible. The next day, James contacted his insurance provider, expecting at least some relief. Instead, he was met with another shocking discovery. His policy had been altered just weeks prior, removing fire coverage entirely. "That's impossible," he argued. "I never made those changes." But the representative insisted the request had come from his account, authorized with his credentials. James hung up, his mind racing. Someone had accessed his insurance account. Someone with inside knowledge, someone who wanted to ensure that if his home burned, he would be left with nothing. The more he thought about it, the more he realized Karen's corruption ran deeper than he had imagined. This was no longer just about HOA fines or property acquisitions. This was an organized criminal operation, one that involved fraud, arson, and potentially even attempted murder. He needed proof, real, undeniable proof that could bring Karen and her accomplices down for good. James hired a private investigator, Mark Calloway, a former police detective with a reputation for uncovering dirt on the powerful. Mark wasted no time digging into Karen's finances, her brother's business dealings, and the suspicious fires that had occurred in Pinecrest Gardens over the past decade. Within a week, he had uncovered a damning paper trail, emails between Karen and Richard discussing handling difficult homeowners, financial transactions linking HOA funds to offshore accounts, and most crucially, surveillance footage from a nearby traffic camera that captured Richard's car parked outside James's home just hours before the fire. With this evidence in hand, James contacted the police. It was time to end Karen's reign of terror once and for all. James knew that exposing Karen publicly was one thing, but ensuring she faced real consequences was another. Armed with the private investigator's findings, he took the evidence straight to the authorities. He met with a district attorney, presenting a carefully compiled case of arson, fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. The DA took one look at the evidence and agreed, this wasn't just HOA corruption. This was organized crime. "We'll need to move carefully," the DA warned. "If she senses we're closing in, she might try to disappear." James also contacted a local news station, leaking the details of Karen's fraudulent practices. Within days, the scandal became headline news. Reporters swarmed Pinecrest Gardens, interviewing former homeowners who had been forced out, exposing how Karen had manipulated HOA bylaws to seize control of properties, and uncovering the fire insurance fraud. The pressure was mounting, and James knew it was only a matter of time before Karen made a mistake. While the legal case was building, James took his revenge in another way, by striking at the very foundation of Karen's power. With his savings and the help of a business partner, he quietly purchased a 30% stake in Evergreen Community Management, the company that managed Pinecrest Gardens, HOA. It was a bold move, one that gave him a direct say in how the HOA operated. At the next board meeting, Karen walked in expecting to conduct business as usual. Instead, James stood up and made an announcement that left her visibly shaken. "As of this morning, I own a controlling interest in the management company that oversees this HOA," he declared. "Effective immediately, I'm launching a full audit of all financial records and practices. Any illegal activities uncovered will be reported directly to law enforcement." The room erupted into chaos. Some board members, realizing their involvement might come to light, turned on Karen, distancing themselves from her. Others tried to object, but the damage was done. James now had the power to expose everything. The breaking point came 2 days later when the police arrived at Karen's house with an arrest warrant. The evidence against her was overwhelming, emails linking her to Richard's shady real estate deals, forensic reports confirming the electrical tampering that led to James's house fire, and phone records placing Richard near the property the night it burned. She was charged with multiple felonies, including arson, conspiracy to commit fraud, and racketeering. Richard was arrested at his office, caught off guard by the swift legal action. Several HOA board members, fearing prosecution, took plea deals, agreeing to testify against Karen in exchange for reduced sentences. The community watched in shock as the once untouchable woman was led away in handcuffs, her carefully constructed empire collapsing around her. For James, it was a moment of vindication. He had fought back and won, not just for himself, but for every homeowner Karen had wronged. With Karen and her corrupt allies gone, Pinecrest Gardens faced a new challenge, restoring trust and repairing the damage left behind. James took an active role in restructuring the HOA, working alongside residents to create fair and transparent policies. They elected a new board, with Sofia Rodriguez, a longtime homeowner and advocate for ethical community management, stepping in as the new president. Together, they repealed many of the restrictive and arbitrary rules Karen had imposed, slashed unnecessary fees, and returned illegally collected fines to affected homeowners. James also helped families like the Millers and Kaplans, who had been forced out, find legal recourse to reclaim their properties. Slowly but surely, the community transformed from a hostile battlefield into a place where people actually wanted to live. James's victory didn't just end in Pinecrest Gardens, it sparked a movement. His case set a legal precedent for homeowners fighting against corrupt HOAs, inspiring new laws that placed stricter regulations on HOA power. His story went viral, leading to interviews, documentaries, and even invitations to speak at housing reform conferences. With his newfound influence, he launched a legal aid fund, helping homeowners across the country challenge unfair HOA practices. Within a year, his fund had assisted homeowners in 27 states, forcing over a dozen corrupt HOAs to face legal scrutiny. Despite all of this, James never saw himself as a hero, just a man who refused to back down. As he stood in front of his newly rebuilt home, now designed to include a community gathering space, he reflected on how far he had come. The battle had nearly cost him everything, but in the end, justice had prevailed. Pinecrest Gardens wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a symbol of what could happen when people stood together against corruption. As the trial against Karen Thompson and her brother Richard began, the courtroom was packed with reporters, former homeowners, and curious residents from Pinecrest Gardens. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: financial records showing fraudulent transactions, surveillance footage of Richard near James's home the night of the fire, and forensic reports confirming electrical tampering. But the most damning evidence came from former HOA board members who had taken plea deals. One by one, they took the stand, each revealing Karen's methods of intimidation, fraud, and outright theft. "Karen told us to find any excuse to fine homeowners she wanted gone," admitted one former board member. "She would personally approve violations that didn't even exist. And if they fought back, she'd double the fines until they had no choice but to sell." The courtroom was silent as another witness, a former HOA inspector, detailed how Karen had manipulated official documents to force homeowners into foreclosure. She wasn't running an HOA, she was running a criminal enterprise. James sat in the gallery, watching as the woman who had tried to destroy his life was now being exposed for the fraud she was. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict: guilty on all charges. Karen was convicted of conspiracy to commit fraud, racketeering, arson, and insurance fraud. Richard was found guilty of aiding and abetting arson and wire fraud. When the judge handed down the sentences, the entire courtroom felt the weight of justice. Karen received 8 years in prison, her brother 5. Several board members, though receiving lighter sentences, were permanently banned from any future HOA involvement. As Karen was led away in handcuffs, she glared at James one last time. "This isn't over," she hissed under her breath. But James knew better. It was over. The courtroom erupted in applause as people hugged and cried. Years of suffering had finally come to an end. Outside the courthouse, James was met by journalists asking what was next for him. His response was simple: "I'm going to make sure this never happens to another homeowner again." With Karen and her corrupt allies out of the picture, Pinecrest Gardens underwent a transformation. The new HOA board, led by Sofia Rodriguez, took immediate steps to restore fairness and transparency. All fraudulent fines were refunded, and new rules were implemented to prevent abuse of power. Homeowners who had been forced out were given the opportunity to reclaim their properties, with legal assistance funded by James's growing legal aid foundation. The neighborhood that had once been defined by fear and corruption was now a thriving, cooperative community. Monthly meetings became open forums where homeowners actually had a voice, and unnecessary restrictions were lifted. Even the smallest victories, like residents being able to paint their doors whatever color they wanted, became symbols of a new era. James, though no longer directly involved in the HOA, remained a guiding force in the background, ensuring that Pinecrest Gardens never fell into darkness. News of Karen's downfall and the HOA's corruption spread far beyond Pinecrest Gardens. Other communities with abusive HOAs began investigating their own leaders, inspired by James's battle for justice. Legal experts and advocacy groups cited his case as a turning point in HOA reform, leading to proposed legislation that aimed to curb the unchecked power of homeowners associations. James found himself at the center of a national movement, with invitations to speak at legal conferences and community town halls. His legal aid fund, initially designed to help Pinecrest residents, expanded rapidly, assisting thousands of homeowners in similar fights. In less than a year, his efforts had contributed to over a dozen corrupt HOA leaders being removed from power. James never sought fame, but his determination had turned him into an icon of resistance against HOA abuse. As the years passed, James continued his work, ensuring that no other family would suffer the way his had. His new home, built on the same land where his old house had burned, was more than just a residence. It was a gathering place for the community. The spacious backyard, once the target of Karen's harassment, now hosted neighborhood events, barbecues, and charity fundraisers. Every time James looked at his rebuilt home, he saw more than walls and a roof. He saw resilience, justice, and the power of standing up against corruption. What had started as a personal fight had become something much bigger. James had not only reclaimed his home but had ignited a movement that was changing lives across the country. And as he stood on his front porch, watching children play freely in the neighborhood that had once been ruled by fear, he knew one thing for certain. He had won, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been bullied by those in power.